You might have noticed that your own thoughts very often aren't especially kind and productive. Very often, our own thoughts are quite cruel and destructive. And if we were to point to the reason for our psychological suffering, a lot of us would identify our own thoughts as a major source of our own misery. So when we realize that, we might have the idea that we need to change our thoughts so that we will not suffer anymore. We need to take these cruel thoughts and turn them into kind or positive thoughts. And of course, that might work to some degree. But at the same time, my sense of this is that we are fighting an uphill battle if this is our approach. When we engage these cruel thoughts on their own term and we approach them with a kind of agenda of wanting to change them or dissolve them or get rid of them, what very often happens is that these thoughts just get only more intense, and our fixation on them also only gets increased. And as a result of that, as a result of wanting to change these cruel thoughts, they only make us suffer even more. So what can we do to get out of this dilemma? Is there a way to not suffer so much as a result of having these thoughts? And my response to this question is very much, yes, there is a way. And the first thing we need to realize is that the thoughts themselves are never the source of our suffering. And you can put this claim to the test right now. Right now, you can have the most negative, destructive thought about yourself. But if you bring it into your awareness with a true kind of clarity and openness, if you simply allow that thought to arise, but you don't identify with it, you don't fixate on it, then it doesn't really have much of an impact. It's more like a cloud passing through the sky. It's there, it's experienced, but it says nothing about you. There it goes, that thought. You might think, I am so worthless. And here it is, that cruel thought about yourself. But what does it do? It's just a bit of language, a kind of sound in your own awareness. It's there for a split second, and then it's gone again. And you might have any kind of thought about yourself, true or not. And they are all just appearing in your own awareness and never do anything to truly impact you. So if you deliberately bring these thoughts into your awareness, you very quickly realize that the thoughts themselves aren't really that problematic. So the interesting question then becomes, what turns these thoughts from just being a bit of language and consciousness into a seeming reality? How does it happen that we take these thoughts and believe that they are fundamentally true, that they describe what we are? Well, one very crucial component is that with these thoughts, there's always a contraction in the body that co-arises with that cruel thought. So as we just saw, if the thought is simply arising and there's no fixation around the thought, then there's also usually not a strong reaction in the body that comes along with that thought. And as a result of that, it's almost like the thought has nothing to substantiate it. We can see clearly that the thought has no basis in reality. It has no impact on us. It doesn't feel real, we could say. If, however, that thought of I am worthless just happens to arise, and at the same time I'm feeling a kind of tightness in my chest, I might then believe that this confirms this experience. Now the thought isn't just an abstract notion about myself, but it has that somatic, that bodily grounding in my experience. And all of a sudden, it really feels like that thought is describing what I am. that thought all of a sudden has a certain kind of sting to it. So it's never just the thought that causes the suffering, but also that neurotic contraction in the body that arises with that. So how does understanding this empower us to not identify with these cruel thoughts, to see them for what they are? Well, the key is to realize that whether the feeling in the body is there or the thought is there, again, doesn't inherently cause us suffering. And just like with the thought, we may notice that the feeling in the body isn't inherently what causes us suffering. I may, for example, feel that same tightness in the chest just because I had a good workout. And in that context, I wouldn't find that feeling in the chest problematic. I wouldn't interpret it as a kind of neurotic emotion in the body. I would just think this is a positive sign of having had a good workout. So again, the sensation and the experience in of itself is not what's problematic. Just like the cruel thought in of itself is not problematic, the contracted feeling in the body in of itself is not problematic. So what is it then that causes us our suffering? Well, there's a very basic mechanism of our own being which turns these innocent experiences of thinking and feeling into an identity. And this mechanism is what I call fixation. You see, what happens is that we identify with our thoughts and with our bodily sensations. And the way this happens on a very basic level is through a kind of fixation of awareness. We can think of it as a kind of trimming down, a sort of contraction of consciousness around an object of perception. It seems all of a sudden that we have become very limited. We have become a separate observer of experience, which is located in the body, and we are now aware of our thoughts and our feelings as this separately existing self. And this is simply a particular way of looking at our experience. When we are fixating, when we are allowing our awareness to become small and sticky and immersed, then all of a sudden we seem to become that cruel thought. It is now all of a sudden not just a temporary experience which passes through awareness, but it has turned into something substantial. We now believe that that thought and that emotion describes what we essentially are. And because this is the relationship we have to our own experience, all of a sudden our own thoughts, that inner critic, that cruel voice, has the power to cause us a tremendous amount of suffering. And we feel like we are at the mercy of our own mind. Whatever thought arises, we seem to become that. If it's a cruel or negative thought, we all of a sudden become that. So what is the antidote? What can we do to break through this cycle of identification and suffering? Well, the very basic step is to simply put the cart behind the horses, to recognize first what we essentially are, to recognize with absolute clarity in our own immediate experience that what we are is not a separate self. We are not some kind of limited entity that is located in the body and has to suffer from these thoughts and these feelings. What we are is pure awakeness, unbounded, centerless, but never separate from any part of our experience. It's everywhere all at once, and yet at the same time it is quite ordinary. I'm simply talking about the consciousness, the awareness, which is hearing my words right now. You are that, and that is not a limited self. It is not defined by a thought. It is not burdened by a neurotic feeling. It is always in that same condition of wholeness, openness, and very fundamentally of peace. And nothing can take that peace away. if you allow your own awareness to open up right now, you can notice that all these cruel thoughts are simply happening in that awareness. They're not happening outside of it. These thoughts are happening in the clarity that is your own being. And that being, that ungraspable being, that pure awakeness, is not located in anything. It's rather the case that everything is located in it, and it has no separation from anything that's in it. So when these cruel thoughts are arising, and instead of becoming identified with them, we are simply being open with them. We are experiencing and holding them with no separation, then all of a sudden they lose their sting, they lose their power over us. They are simply part of our field of experience. They have no more power over us than any object you might see, or any sound you may hear. They're simply part of this flow of peace. And as a result of this shift in our awareness, the cruel thought doesn't even seem so cruel anymore. What very often happens subsequently is that these cruel thoughts get unburdened. They become light and floaty, and they turn into something much more positive. But it's not that we force this transformation to happen. It's just how our thoughts tend to respond to our shift, to this change in what we are aware as. If we are aware as a seemingly separate self, then our thoughts will correspond to that sense of limitation, to that feeling of being trapped and localized. But if we are aware as our true nature, that pure unbounded awakeness, then our thoughts eventually will also more and more have that perfume of freedom. And cruel thoughts will arise less and less and less. But it's not that we have an agenda to make this happen. It's just the natural flowering out of this recognition. So to sum it all up, what to do about these cruel thoughts is simply to recognize what you are most fundamentally and relate to your thoughts from your true nature. As a result, these thoughts will become light and unburdened, and the nature of these thoughts will change over time. But all along this path, the most important thing is to recognize the freedom and wholeness that's always and already yours.